Welcome, Dina.
Okay, so good morning. I think today we're going to discuss how we can ensure that patients get the right medicines, both in time of crisis and beyond. And it's certainly a great pleasure to be here today. So my name is Dr. Dina Radenkovic, and I'm a medical doctor, and I work in the field of computational medicine. I'm a Chief Science Officer of HLPO Life, a research clinic focused on longevity, and a partner at the SALT Fund looking at life sciences. Previously, I worked at Guy's and St. Thomas's Hospital at King's College London, and Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard University, and I've trained at UCL Medical School. Today, I have a pleasure to be joined by two excellent speakers in the area, and I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we're going to crack on. Please do ask questions as we go along. I want to keep this quite interactive, but obviously we will kind of allow about the last 20 minutes for more of a roundtable discussion. So if you want to save the question for later, that would also be fine. So I think firstly, if Lachlan, do you maybe want to just give us a bit of background about yourself?
Thanks, Dina. Hi, everyone. My name's Lachlan, and for the past 5 years, I've been a VC at a company called Oxford Sciences Innovation, which is a kind of big, deep tech fund. We're mainly involved in setting up companies at the earliest stages, and I've been involved in setting up numerous kind of biotechnology drug development companies. And I'm currently chairman of Spy Biotech, which is a vaccine company, and we've got a very exciting COVID program. But today I've been told we're definitely not talking about vaccines. We're talking about medicines that we already have and already exist, and how we can get the most use out of them. And I've mainly looked at this problem from the VC perspective, because whenever there's a massive inefficiency in a system, people are trying to create companies that solve those things. And so it's a great pleasure to also have Peter here today, who's probably built one of the most successful companies in the space. So yeah, I'll hand over to Peter to introduce himself.
Thanks, Lachlan. So I'm Peter George, and previously I founded Clinigen and was the CEO of Clinigen. But maybe to put that into context with today's discussion, just talk about why I founded Clinigen. So previous to Clinigen, I owned and ran a contract manufacturing company called Penn Pharmaceuticals. And we manufactured, and were probably best known for manufacturing at that time, thalidomide. So there's a strange link here between access to medicines and thalidomide. But I was fascinated that thalidomide came back into use because it was being used off-label for the treatment of leprosy. And that led me to think about how many other medicines are used off-label. And then that led me to a fascinating fact that I didn't believe at first, that 80% of the world's population cannot get access to the medicine they need to treat their disease, largely because it's not licensed in the country where they're being treated for their disease. Didn't believe that fact, but then looked a little bit deeper into it, and it's true that 5.5 to 6 billion people in the world can't get access to the medicine they need. So that led me to found Clinigen in 2010, which was founded to provide access to medicines to improve the quality of people's lives around the world. We had a little strapline: right medicine, right patient, right time. And we were focused on the three stages of the drug life cycle: clinical trial, managed access, and licensed medicines. In fact, we invented the phrase managed access to medicines. And it's fascinating when you look into this area of difficult access for patients, the problems that it leads to across the world. It drives counterfeit drugs, and the huge problem of counterfeit drugs. There's more money earned through the illicit supply of counterfeit drugs than there is other illicit drugs. It leads to drug shortages. It leads to off-label uses of medicines. It leads to all of these issues. But going back to the very basics, I said that 80% of the world's population don't get access to medicine. 2 billion people in the world have no access to basic medicines. those that have been classified by the WHO as basic medicines. So that led to the creation of Clinigen. It became a very, very successful company. It still is a very successful company. It was one of the fastest growing companies in the UK. So that's my background and hopefully intro into some of the discussions we're going to have today.
Well, thanks, Peter.
Sorry, Dina. I was going to butt in. Given kind of like pharma companies spend all this money developing these products, why do you think they're not kind of incentivized to ensure their distribution and get to the patients? And why aren't they incentivized to kind of really study their broader impact?
I think it's quite complex. Some people would argue that it's related to the patent process and the limited period that pharmaceutical companies have to recover their investment that they've made into developing a new medicine. Innovative medicines cost many billions of pounds to bring to market. So they tend to be premium priced, and therefore it tends to be those countries with the more advanced health systems that can afford premium priced medicines. So that's one issue, but that doesn't really explain why your essential medicines, which are probably, undoubtedly no longer under patent protection, they're quite often genericized, even those medicines aren't made available globally and easily. So it's quite complex as to why that happens. But the other issue that I think is a massive issue is that regulators don't talk to each other. The FDA, the EMEA don't have mutual recognition. So you have to go through this complex process of jumping through hoops for regulators to get your drug licensed in a certain country. And there is no hardly any mutual recognition by any countries around the world to say, well, it's licensed there, so therefore you can get a fast track here, or vice versa. There's a lot of self-interest in government, in regulators, in pharmaceutical companies. There's all sorts of issues, and they're very complex, that drive the reasons why. But at the end of the day, we spend billions, hundreds of billions on innovative new medicine. And we spend next to nothing on getting those medicines already available to patients that need them across the world. I mean, there are some access, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has done an amazing job on meningitis and various other access to medicines around the world. But that's a very unusual case compared to the number of medicines that are needed.
For sure, and thanks, Peter, for really outlining the problem. The one thing I'd like to say, though, is that the lack of even commonly and already approved medicines and off-patent drugs is not just something that happens around the world. It certainly has happened recently, and it has happened even in this country, and we've seen it in this healthcare system, particularly with obviously the stress of the global pandemic. And I think the one issue where we all got frustrated, and to be honest, what we suggested this topic for the panel discussion, was that there's so much need. It's always about, let's create a new molecule, let's create a new target. Okay, this pathway works and can extend, promote longevity or improve health or help with whichever medical condition. But what's the incentive of using already approved drugs? Why would we ever study what we have? The drugs for which have long safety profiles, we know that they might be relatively safe. We know how to use them. We have clinical experience, because the financial incentive is to go and create something new. And when we looked into it, why can we use some of the already approved drugs and maybe repurpose them for other indications? Drugs such as metformin, aspirin, statins that have been overly prescribed for many things, but there's a lot of scientific literature suggesting that it might have benefit in other indications. And then the rules have said exactly what you said. The regulators are different. And then one would have to run a Me Too clinical trial, and then they would only have the royalties to sell it for the next 10 years. So they just said, look, this is not a sustainable business model. If you think this drug works, just create something similar and go through the whole phase development. Do you think that there's something that needs to change to incentivize perhaps a different player, maybe a different version of companies that would just focus on already approved drugs, with good safety profile and trying to see how we can maximize them. Because I think when we reviewed the data, we realized that most drugs are not licensed. No one reviews. The drug gets approved, it gets licensed for a certain medication, and then 20 years afterwards, kind of clinicians around the world learn to use it for many other things. But then it's difficult to get reimbursed, the regulators do not talk. Is there any way that we could create a hybrid company or ensure that pharma companies do that they actually make the already approved drugs more dynamic and incentivize them to reuse it, even though the financial gains are obviously not as when creating a new drug?
Yeah, well, I think, people have been talking about real world evidence for a long time, that clinicians are using these drugs in the real world to treat patients off label. They reckon that 20% of commonly used medicines are prescribed. Those prescriptions are off label 20% of the time. And in children, of course, it's much higher. You're talking 80% of children that are released from pediatric hospitals are prescribed at least one medicine off label, because of course clinical studies are often not done in under 18-year-olds, so invariably they're off label. And you've got drugs that are first line treatment in certain areas. Neuropathic pain, the first line treatment for neuropathic pain is tricyclics, and they're not licensed for neuropathic pain, but clinicians use it as the first line treatment. So it is bizarre that.
What I find.
Sorry, go.
Yeah, it's kind of all the information's being lost. There's kind of, patients know what works, doctors have suspicions, and there's this huge kind of like treasure trove of information which is not systematized, is not digitally stored, and it's not provided back to the pharma companies in order to help them make new products and work out the mechanism of action of existing products. Exactly. And we've got one company that you can actually triangulate the mechanism of action of a drug from electronic health records. If you have enough data, you can get into the biochemistry, which is a kind of amazing thing. And I guess there's a big opportunity for someone who can solve this and systematize kind of patient experience. And
we use that. In a couple of cases, Lachlan, Clinigen used that type of data, and I'll give you two examples. One which is quite positive on a regulatory agency as well, actually. But we have a medicine, cardioxane, which is dexrazoxane, used for patients who are on anthracyclines to stop cardiomyopathy. And it had a black box warning around it because the wrong mode of action had been put on its original license. And once we understood the actual mode of action, it was clear that could not have been a side effect of the medicine that was causing it. It was a side effect of the cancers that was causing the issue that was seen. So we managed to get the black box removed, and it was allowed again to be used in children, who 50% of children are treated with anthracyclines for their cancer. So it's very important. And another example is a medicine, Foscavir. 99% of its usage was off-label for treating patients who had transplants, rather than its original licensed indication as an antiviral. And in Japan, they actually do accept real-world evidence, and they accept clinicians in Japan will review real-world evidence and make recommendations to the Japanese regulatory authorities to get these indications put on label. So there are regulatory instances where this does work. It's just not common practice and isn't shared amongst regulators, which is a massive issue. I think, Dina, you said the other day when we were talking, why isn't there a NATO for regulators? So that, this can all be agreed. That the World Health Organization published its first model list of essential medicines in 1977. And we still haven't, I don't know how many years later, I can't work that out. We still haven't got this agreement about how this happens across the world.
If you think about kind of tech companies, and I don't know if everyone's watched The Social Dilemma recently, but it's, most people knew this already, but they spend all their time trying to figure out everything about you. And, their whole business model relies on knowing you and knowing how you're likely to act. And, looking at why hasn't pharma embraced those tech-enabled digital solutions to figure out, what is a drug doing, what's its mechanism of action, what are its unexpected potential indications it can work in, and but where do you think the blame rests then? Is it with pharma companies? Is it with doctors? Is it with pharmacies? Who in the chain, or governments, who in the chain is kind of most responsible for this?
Again, I think Dina summed it up the other day when we were talking. It's the fear of getting it wrong stops us getting it right. It's so that the regulatory authorities came into place for very good reason to stop some of the errors that were happening in the licensing of medicines. That the thalidomide is a classic story, but of course, the FDA came into play because counterfeit medicines had leaked into the supply chain in 1937. There was I think 110 patients died from medicines that had ethylene glycol in. So that's what sparked the FDA. So it's fear of getting it wrong that swings the pendulum so far to the safe that logic goes out of the window, because clearly if you've got things like tricyclics or a first-line treatment in neuropathic pain, they've got a very good safety profile. There's loads and loads of evidence that suggests that it is working. So why can we not go back and look at that and say, well, there's no safety issues here. We do need to control dosage and various other things, but safety is not the issue. And it is this fear of getting it wrong, I think. And again, let's be honest that if you didn't have those controls, then people would abuse them. And counterfeit medicines is a classic example of people abusing those situations. And in some cases, in particular in Africa, it's a massive issue. There's 2 million people die a year from counterfeit medicines. So there are people that will abuse every situation, but I think we're talking here about ethical pharmaceutical industry being and the ethical use of that, allowing doctors to utilize that real world evidence to treat patients better. And it's just, I don't know, it's failing.
I guess it's, to me, kind of the doctors, they have the information, but they're not allowed to provide that to pharma companies because there's all kinds of rules about doctors communicating and being influenced by pharma. So is that, Dina, I don't know whether you have a perspective on the kind of pharma medicinal community engagement and whether information's being lost there that could otherwise be utilized out of basically, clearly like the ethics is important, but when there's such a big problem.
Yeah, the thing is that I would like to structure this as some kind of, let's identify the problems and let's try to find with some kind of potential constructive ideas how these could be fixed. There's certainly already a lot of burden on doctors, and I think encouraging stronger links and communication between pharma companies and the clinicians is probably going to be damaging for the public trust of the profession and the incentives of prescribing these drugs. I think we've identified a couple of issues here. So the first issue is that there's no financial incentive of seeing whether or not we can solve the problem what we already have. There's a much bigger financial incentive to just find novel solutions, even though what we already have might fix the problem as well and more efficiently. So that's the first problem. So how do we fix that? The second one is, obviously, we've discussed that probably the ones to blame for that, for this kind of disparity between financial gains and purpose and meaningful contribution to the society, comes from the fact that the regulators are too strict. They're not talking to each other. We collaborate on war, we collaborate on politics, we collaborate everything else, but we don't want to collaborate on for health. And health is, particularly in this matter, certainly a global issue. So I think what we could discuss there is that certainly the checks that are in place already are super important to just ensure that patients trust the drugs that they're getting and that they know that they have been rigorously studied. But that's why I think the market that we're discussing here is really for the drugs that have already been approved. So we do believe that the regulator plays a major role in like before the drug gets into the market. There's this post-market surveillance, picking up all the side effects. But once drug has been approved and in use for 20 to 30 years, there's so much knowledge for a couple of these drugs, some of them we've named, and potential other indications. So how do we then collect that information, feed it back, and how do we even run more clinical trials with drugs that have already been approved? So that's, I think, where the question lies. And I don't know, maybe should pharma companies speak direct to consumer? Should they collect data? Should pharma companies be more vertically integrated? Is there a player? Yeah. Is there a space for a next player? What do you think?
I think there's a really interesting current example, which is psychedelics, where they're starting to be used for mental health conditions, and they kind of fit this pattern of it's a known compound which has known effects, which you can't patent the basic chemical matter, but companies are finding ways to get them through trials in mental health related indications. And one way that Compass Pathways did it, for instance, was they've got a patent on reformulation. So they've got they're using psilocybin, it's reformulated, and they view that as sufficient to raise investment and run trials in depression. So that's definitely a kind of one way of doing it.
But even when there are positive examples of where this real world data has been put into play, Avastin is a great example in wet AMD, isn't it? Where in the UK, NICE and a number of health authorities approved Avastin for use because it was so much cheaper than Lucentis, which is effectively the same drug, originally developed by the same company. Genentech developed both Avastin and Lucentis, and then out-licensed Lucentis to Novartis, and they were competing in the market, completely different price points. But in wet AMD, which was off-label, Novartis then challenged the UK's view on that Avastin could be used in this area, even though it was unlicensed. They challenged it as being an off-label usage for a medicine, and it was inappropriate. And it was just, why would you challenge something like that? Why would you put yourself in the firing line to do that? And the reason is because it costs so much money for them to develop these drugs and so much money to get this new approval that they are trying to raise the point to regulators and to governments that some of these hurdles need to be removed to make it easier. So it's very, very complex. Patient safety needs to be the first thing that is looked at for sure, but I think things like patient advocacy groups are really interesting now because they're driving some of the changes in behavior. They're supporting some of the pharmaceutical companies in their applications. They're driving some of the releasing of off-label usage into particular orphan diseases, I think. But, there's been good examples recently of patient advocacy groups. I think, what were the two in the US? I think Vertex Pharma had one which a patient advocacy group supported in cystic fibrosis, and the FDA gave it approval. And then there's the other one, I think Sprout Pharma was another one, which is not quite the same. It's the little pink pill for female sex drive, but that was also supported by a patient advocacy group and got FDA approval. So you can see that patient voice is becoming stronger. I think you were discussing this, Lachlan, the other day as well, about how the patient advocacy and the patient voice maybe will change behavioral change within the pharma industry. And what
people get as kind of health information gets democratized, it makes those patient groups much more powerful. And people are smart and they work out what works. And I think we'll see a kind of increasing, it's happening already, but the doctor is the middleman in the situation, and between the people making products and the people consuming them. And we know that over time, middlemen get cut out of situations by automation and by democratized access to information. So I think I do expect the drive to come from the patient side.
And probably the biggest acceptance that there is a problem and the problem needs to be overcome is that, of course, clinicians have the right to prescribe what they think is the right medicine to treat their patient. So they're allowed to prescribe off-label or unlicensed medicines. Quite often they want to get a form signed to protect themselves at a later date from being sued on it, but they have a right to do that. So there is an acceptance that clearly there is a need for it. What's your view on that, Dina?
Yeah, sometimes it's difficult regarding patient reimbursement and also speaking about liability, and that is that often some of the more senior physicians would kind of have would feel comfortable about prescribing off-label drugs, or the others would be, how would you justify why haven't you followed the guidelines? Now, if guidelines are not getting updated, as we discussed as regularly, then you're shifting away your practice from the guidelines. So I think there's certainly, we do allow that option, but perhaps it could be encouraged a bit more, just made a bit more dynamic. I think the other point that I'd like to touch upon is kind of the supply chain of medicine, because we've seen that some of the commonly used drugs, like first-line treatments for community-acquired pneumonia, in penicillin allergy, like antibiotics like levofloxacin, we're kind of running out in major London hospitals, so a bit of shortages during the late spring months. And what are your thoughts on the supply chain of medicines, and how can let's focus, maybe go back on like the global issue and the production and redistribution of the already approved drugs?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of issues with drug shortages worldwide, and what are the causes of drug shortages? And quite often those are difficult to manufacture medicines that when they lose their patent protection and go genericized, then the price falls through the floor, quite rightly. But if they're difficult to manufacture medicines, then the API manufacturers, the finished product manufacturers find it difficult to manufacture at a margin that makes it worth their while. And then one of the biggest issues, I think, was highlighted in 2013. You may remember Benvenue Laboratories was closed down by the FDA and the EMA, and it made sterile injectables and had some of I think they made 27 medicines solely out of there that were sterile. And it led to a shortage in Europe of 17 sterile injectables went into shortage. Calyx or Doxil was one of the biggest ones that went into worldwide shortage. It led to the suspension of 2 licenses in Europe because you couldn't get supply of those medicines. And that's because in my view, what had happened is Big Pharma had outsourced the manufacturing supply chain to CMOs. And then year on year, they started imposing pricing restrictions on those CMOs. They wanted a 7% cost improvement, followed by a 7% cost improvement, followed by a 7% cost improvement. So the margin for the CMO got smaller and smaller and smaller. And therefore, they started compromising on quality. And then when the FDA and the EMA inspected those plants, the quality wasn't up to it. The sterile environment wasn't good enough, and they withdrew the license because they were fearful of quality of product getting into the market, which is fair enough. The industry had strangled itself by sourcing it, and then the finance division wanted price improvement, rather than looking at quality of product that was out there in the market. So there are issues for sure.
It's a tough business, like contract manufacturing organizations, because the price pressure is just relentless. And if you refuse to produce something, you can go and get it made somewhere else at a drop of a hat. And there's no kind of protection. So then you end up, but these are ultimately they're making vital products. So they're kind of, it's a commodity industry making unbelievably vital, important products. And those two things kind of don't marry that well.
Yeah, they don't. And it's a massive issue. And of course that when you get shortage of supply, it's not surprising that counterfeiters target those medicines that are in shortage of supply. They target things that are either difficult to get hold of or are too expensive. You know, the most commonly counterfeit medicine in the world apparently is HIV medicine. So imagine if you've got HIV and you're taking a medicine that doesn't even have the active ingredient in it, so you're not actually being treated. You know, it's a disgrace, absolute disgrace. But not surprisingly, you know, people do target those areas that are difficult to supply. So the supply chain is critical that it's got right. And I think, you know, I know we're not talking COVID, but I think, you know, the UK government in particular has realized that with COVID and medicines to treat COVID, that it's realized it has no control over its own supply chain, over its own manufacture of essential medicines. And there's a bit of a panic going on.
Absolutely. It's just a perfect timing to rethink what we're already doing. Why are we making the full use of what we already have? And how can we ensure that we even keep what we already have? But what does this tell us about the system? That if fake drugs are making more money than illicit drugs, like how can we change that? And why don't the regulators talk to each other?
Well, you know, I think, unfortunately, as the WHO has been trying since 1973, I guess the three of us aren't going to have that big an impact. But it is something that really does need to be pushed up the agenda. And I think the global pandemic is having some impact on that. You know, I think that people are realizing those issues. But it really, there's a massive political agenda. You know, that I'm convinced that, you know, if whenever I've tried to get a medicine approved in the US, I'm convinced it would be easier if I was an American company than it is being a European company. And that can't be right. I mean, surely approval of a medicine is on the evidence that's provided and whether the medicine is good or not good, not on whether I'm a European-based company or a US-based company. And, you know, I'm sure the FDA would say that I'm being absolutely scandalous there, but I'm saying I'm convinced. I'm not saying it's a fact. I'm just saying I'm convinced. So, you know, and it probably feels the same the opposite way around with the EMEA. If you're a US company, I don't know. But those type of things should not be the case. So there is definitely too much politics involved. And, you know, there have been things that have improved the supply chain. And I think the WHO has done an amazing job in improving the quality of manufacturing that's coming out of India and China, raising the standards there. And there's been agreements that have improved many medicines coming out of cheaper manufacturing environments, which is a good thing for global supply. So that there have been they have done some good things, but we just haven't gone far enough, in my view.
Certainly. Great efforts, but unfortunately not sufficient to solve the problem at this scale. And certainly something that we discussed with the EMA, MHRA, FDA, if there could be even like licensing agreements, that if something gets approved by one agency, can get fast-tracked by other, and that is not a separate process. And if the process could become less costly, then it would have been faster and more efficient to go through it, and perhaps the allowing maybe, I don't know if we already said, to kind of summarize, I guess, this issue before we move on to questions, is if so, Lachlan, you said the doctors are going to get removed, which, you know, we will discuss, and I think Eric Topo is speaking afterwards, and he can tell us why doctors not removed, regardless of AI, because of the need for empathy and clinical judgment and human relationships. But I think what we can definitely say is, if we say that pharma companies bring something to the market, there's going to be, doctors will be the one probably trying to help patients make the most informed decisions and still being the gatekeepers of these drugs. But should there be almost like a regular check-in from pharma companies to consumers, and then like a more direct, fast-track process of relicensing for new indications and building that relationships? Like, should pharma companies develop sub companies and speak, I guess, direct to consumers? And would VCs back these type of companies or initiatives?
Yeah, I think sooner or later, someone's going to create a company which gets consumer information in real time about the effects, side effects, and process of taking the medicines that they're taking. And they'll find a way to get that information and incentivize consumers to give it to them. And then once they've got it, it's a hugely valuable business to then sell that information on in the right form. And it will, it obviously it's a commercial entity, but it will create value and for patients and the system in general.
Yeah.
Okay, so looking back at some of the questions that we got from the audience, I think, Lachlan, maybe if you start with this one, was what's your opinion on personalized medicine startups like Parsley Health that have been recently backed by VCs? And I guess maybe we can touch upon the direct-to-consumer healthcare companies.
It's kind of linked to the real-world evidence question we were talking about before, because I think that Parsley is that it's holistic approach and doctor-led treatment, isn't it? So it kind of is one of the first ones to be backed by VC, which I think is interesting. I mean, I don't know a lot about Parsley Health, to be honest, just know what it does, but it's an interesting concept, and if VC is backing it, I mean, what's your view on that, Lachlan?
Yeah, I think we're going to see. It's the first, and we're going to see more and more. I think there will be a kind of powerful winner takes all dynamic here as well, where because patients take products made by multiple manufacturers and multiple owners, and I think it's quite interesting that if you look at the brand of medicines, the brand of the product sits way higher than the brand of the pharma company that created it, and those kind of dynamics mean that there could be one player who accretes all of that information. Like, I don't think a pharma company could do it because they don't have enough products in the roster of any individual patient's kind of medication. So it has to be done from the other side in terms of aggregating that information.
I think one of the potential blockers to getting a lot of this information is, there's a huge amount of epidemiological data out there. I mean, the NHS is the world's best producer of epidemiological data, but our fear of data sharing means that it's very, very hard to get that data into a real world evidence data where it can be used successfully. We put so many constraints on sharing patient data, even though you don't want the name or the address of the patient. The fear is that just by having the sex and the age, that patients can be tracked, but you have to have sex and age as part of your epidemiological footprint to really put the data into context. So it's virtually impossible in many cases to utilize some of the powerful data that's there. Governments aren't doing it. Universities are, to be fair, and OSI is a great example of a couple of companies that have created some amazing data-driven models to improve healthcare. But once it comes out of that university environment, it's quite hard for it to continue utilizing that data. So there are things that block us being able to do it, which is a shame, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that when we were discussing it already, I think we could all picture the fear that could be said, oh, someone's going to track how I'm responding to this medicine, sell this information to pharma. And I think we suggested that there's a place for some new commercial entities in between pharma and consumers. But on the other hand, how to ensure the flow of information that basically making the system more complex is not going to make it more prone to abuse, as we already discussed. That even the current system is getting abused with the counterfeit drugs.
But even when we do have data collection, and I just noticed what one of the questions that from the audience is about our view on opioids, and I think that's fascinating because when you collect pharmacovigilance data, which every company is obliged to do on its medicines, that pharmacovigilance data, which tells you about the side effects and the issues that these drugs have with patients, often that data isn't used to withdraw medicines from the market that probably in many cases should have massive restrictions placed upon their prescription. And opioids is the classic issue. In the US, it's a massive issue of over-prescribing. And there's obvious problems associated with it. The pharmacovigilance is clear. The data is overwhelming. But the problem is not being resolved. It's I don't know. When the data's there, it gets used for the wrong things too often.
Oh, well, quite a lot of problems, but I hope we did provide some ideas for improvement as well. Okay, so I think this was a great discussion, and thank you so much, Peter and Lachlan, for sharing your time. And I think if we just maybe want to conclude with perhaps one kind of take-home message from here that we would like people who've been listening to this discussion to try and change and help us make a better use of the already approved medicines. So my probably would be that even though there's already a lot of responsibility on patients, that patients need to be given a bigger voice, and we've seen it with some of the rare diseases and orphan drugs and the success of patient advocate groups, and that we need to get the patient voice even louder to ensure that what we already have works for them, because that's the aim and the main goal. I don't know if you want to maybe give me one or two as well, and then we're going to conclude the session.
I think that's definitely number one for me, the one that you've picked there. But I think the WHO has some very strong arguments here that continually get knocked back by government. The clue's in the title, isn't it? World Health Organization. They are concerned about health in the world, and we should be listening to that organization rather than the self-interests of governments who keep blocking some of the suggestions that they're making. But if you look at the multiple suggestions that they've made to improve this situation, in many ways they understand the problem, and they've provided many of the answers that we're looking for, but they cannot get agreement to put these things into place. So we should listen to what they're saying much more frequently, because they do know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I think there's something you said, Peter, that lots of people are kind of profiting from the complexity right now. Lots of kind of intermediary groups between kind of product and patient, and the more that governments can do to ease that, I think we'll see better scalable solutions come out of it.
Yeah, I mean, there was somebody in the UK a few years ago who was prosecuted for counterfeit medicines. And these were counterfeit medicines that were used in oncology. So it was an absolute disgrace. They had no active ingredient in them. They made many millions of pounds from this counterfeit program. He was prosecuted. He was given a 5-year suspended sentence and a 6 months community work. Now, if somebody had made, £2 million from supply of cannabis, trust me, it would not have been a 5-year suspended sentence. So maybe we could just increase some of the fines and legal issues around some of the things that are wrong in medicines as well. That would help.
Wow, controversial. Okay. Well, on that note, thank you very much, Peter and Lachlan, and thank you everyone for having us and staying with us this morning. And we hope to see some positive change in this field and ensure that patients do get the right medicine, both in time of crisis and beyond. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.